Chapter 24 of The Dude Wrangler by Caroline Lockhart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 24. Hicks, the Avenger. The remarkable change in Mr. Hicks' manner continued the next morning. It was so radical that no one could fail to observe it, and the comments were frequent, while Mrs. Stott crowed openly. From haughty independence he had become so anxious to please that he was almost servile, and his manner toward the wife of the rising young attorney, particularly, was that of a humble retainer fawning at the feet of royalty. During breakfast he stood at a respectful distance, speaking only when spoken to and jumping to serve them. This attitude quickly dissipated the fear which he had inspired in the Happy Family, and by noon they were not only calling him Hicks, but Ellery. Then, this stage of familiarity having been passed in safety, Mr. Stott humorously dubbed him Cookie, and the name was adopted by everyone. Mrs. Budlong ventured to complain that there was too much shortening in the biscuit. This was a real test of the sincerity of his reformation, since, if such a thing were possible, he had been even more touchy upon the subject of his cooking than his dignity. No one could doubt but that the change was genuine when he not only received the criticism meekly but actually thanked her for calling his attention to it. Thus encouraged, Mr. Appel declared that he wished he would not fry the ham to chips and boil the daylights out of the coffee. Mr. Hicks bowed servilely and replied that he would try to remember in future. Mrs. Stott took occasion to remark that his vegetables would be better for less seasoning and more cooking, and Miss Gaskett thought his dried fruit would be improved by soaking overnight and additional sweetening. Mr. Hicks received these criticisms in a humility that was pathetic when compared with his former arrogance. He looked crushed as he stood with bowed head and drooping shoulders, as if his proud, untrammeled spirit had been suddenly broken. Miss Eyster felt sorry for him and asserted that she would not recall when she had enjoyed food so much and eaten so heartily. Indeed, she had been such a gourmand that she had gained 1 pound and 6 ounces, if the scales upon which she had been weighed in Prouty were accurate. Mr. Stott, however, who was in one of his waggish moods, undid all that she might have accomplished in the way of soothing Hicks' injured feelings by inquiring facetiously if he would mind rolling him out a couple of pie crusts to be tanned and made into bedroom slippers. Mr. Hicks laughed heartily along with the others, and only Wallie caught the murderous glitter through his downcast lashes. It developed that the Yellowstone Park was a place with which Hicks was thoroughly familiar from having made several trips around the circle. He was not only acquainted with points of interest off the beaten track, passed unseen by the average tourist, but he suggested many original and diverting sports, like sliding down a snowbank in a frying pan, which would not have occurred to any of them. By the time the party had reached the Lake Hotel they were consulting him like a Baedeker, and he answered every question, however foolish, with a patience and an affability that were most praiseworthy. Their manner toward him was a kind of patronizing camaraderie, while Mrs. Stott treated him with the gracious tolerance of a great lady unbending. A disbelief in the ability of the leopard to change its spots made Wallie skeptical regarding Hicks' altered disposition, yet he did his best to convince himself that he was wrong when Hicks went out and caught a trout from the Yellowstone Lake expressly for Mrs. Stott's supper. It was a beautiful fish as it lay on the platter, brown, crisp, and ornamented with lemon. Mr. Hicks offered it much as the head of John the Baptist might have been brought to "Salome." "Thank you, Hicks," said Mrs. Stott, kindly. "I hope you'll like it, ma'am," he murmured humbly. The mark of favour seemed to bear out Mrs. Stott's contention that inferiors should not be treated as equals in any circumstances. Now, with her fork in the fish, Mrs. Stott looked around the table and inquired graciously if she might not divide it with someone. Everyone politely declined except Mrs. Budlong, who looked at it so wistfully that Mrs. Stott lost no time in transferring it to her plate. She ate with gusto and declared after tasting it: "It is delicious, simply delicious. I never remember eating another with quite the same delicate flavour. I presume," addressing herself to Mr. Hicks, who was standing with arms akimbo, enjoying her enjoy it, "it is due to something in the water?" "I presume so," he replied respectfully, and added: "The trout in the Yellowstone Lake are said to be very nourishing." It was natural that Mrs. Stott should feel a little flattered by this evidence of partiality even from a menial. Also she noticed that Mrs. Budlong was following each mouthful with the eyes of a hungry bird dog, so she could not refrain from saying further: "It is such a delightful change from ham and bacon. I am not sure," she averred laughingly, "that I shall not eat the head and fins even." "I wish I was in such favour," Mrs. Budlong declared enviously. "Never mind, honey dumplin'," said Mr. Budlong. "I shall go out after supper and catch your breakfast." "You ought to get a boatload," Hicks added quickly, "if you find the right place." "I saw them jumping by the million where I was walking before supper." Mr. Appel volunteered to conduct Mr. Budlong to the spot as soon as they were finished eating. Everyone who had fishing tackle decided to avail himself of this wonderful opportunity, and they all followed Mr. Appel except Mr. and Mrs. Stott, who preferred to fish by themselves from the bridge over the Yellowstone River. They were the last to leave, but returned in not more than 20 minutes, Mr. Stott supporting his wife in what seemed to be a fainting condition. Wallie hastened forward to lend his assistance if necessary. "Is she ill?" he inquired solicitously. "Ill! She is sick at her stomach, and no wonder!" He was plainly angry and appeared to direct his wrath at Wallie. While Wallie wondered, it did not seem a propitious moment to ask questions, and he would have turned away had Mr. Stott not said peremptorily: "Wait a minute, I want to speak to you." Having laid Mrs. Stott, who was shuddering, on her blankets and administered a few drops of aromatic spirits of ammonia, he dropped the flap of her teepee and beckoned Wallie curtly: "You come with me." Wallie could not do else than follow him, his wonder growing as he led the way to the camp kitchen where Mr. Hicks was engaged at the moment in the task which he referred to as "pearl diving." He did not appear surprised to see them in his domain. On the contrary, he seemed rather to be expecting them, for immediately he took his hands out of the dish water, wiped them on the corner of his apron, and reaching for a convenient stick of stove wood, laid it on the corner of the table with a certain significance in the action. "Make yerself to home, gents," he said hospitably, indicating the wagon tongue and a cracker box for seats, respectively. "Anything in particular I can do for you?" He looked at Mr. Stott guilelessly. "You can answer me a few questions." Mr. Stott fixed a sternly accusing eye upon him. "Hicks, was or was not that trout you gave my wife wormy?" Mr. Hicks, who seemed to relish the situation, pursed his lips and considered. Finally he asked in a tone which showed that he had pride in his legal knowledge: "Will I or will I not incriminate myself by answering?" You probably will if I'm correct in my suspicions. I want the truth." "Then," replied Mr. Hicks, while his hand slipped carelessly to the stick of stove wood, "if you force the issue, I will say that I've seen a good many wormy trout come out of the Yellowstone, but that was the worst I ever met up with." Mr. Stott advanced belligerently. "And you dare boast of it?" "I'm not boasting, I'm just telling you," replied Mr. Hicks calmly. "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's my motto, and your wife thought I wasn't good enough to eat at the table with her." "You hear?" Stott turned to Wallie furiously. "He did it on purpose. I demand that you discharge this fellow." Mr. Hicks' fingers caressed the stove wood while he waited Wallie's answer. Wallie squirmed between the two of them. "It was reprehensible, Mr. Stott. I am more distressed than I can tell you. I have no excuse to offer for Hicks' action. But the truth is, as he knows and has taken advantage of it, I cannot replace him, and it is impossible to get along without a cook with so large a party." "You will then not discharge him?" Stott demanded. "I am helpless," Wallie reiterated. Hicks grinned triumphantly. "In that case," Mr. Stott declared in a tone which implied that a tremendous upheaval of some kind would follow his decision, "my wife and I will leave your party and continue through the park by motor." Wallie felt that it was useless to argue with anyone so determined, so he made no effort to persuade Mr. Stott to remain, though the deflection of two more persons was a serious matter to him and Pinkey. Without waiting to say good bye to the others, the Stotts paid their bill and departed, walking so erect in their indignation as they started down the road toward the Lake Hotel that they seemed to lean backward. It was not yet dark when Mr. Stott, stepping briskly and carrying his Gladstone bag, raincoat, and umbrella in a jaunty manner, came into camp, announcing breezily that he had decided, upon reflection, not to bite off his nose to spite his face. He declared that he would not let the likes of Ellery Hicks upset his plans for touring the Yellowstone, and while his wife refused to return, he meant to carry out his original intention. But the real reason for Mr. Stott's decision, as Wallie suspected from the frequency with which he had discovered him sitting upon a log in secluded spots, counting his money, was that the hotel rates and motor fare were far higher than he had anticipated. Mrs. Stott's absence did not leave the gap which she had anticipated. In fact, after the first evening her name was never mentioned, and Mr. Stott's marital ties rested so lightly upon him that a stranger would never have known they existed. He gravitated toward Miss Gaskett with a promptitude which gave rise to the suspicion that he had had his eye upon her, and Miss Gaskett responded so enthusiastically that it was a matter for gossip. It was noted that she took to doing her hair up at night on wavers, and used her lipstick with greater frequency, and whereas she had vowed she meant never again to get in the saddle, she now rode with Mr. Stott daily. The ladies who had known Miss Gaskett for 25 years, and nothing to her discredit, were not prepared to say that she was a hussy and a vampire without further evidence, but they admitted to each other, privately, that they always had felt there was something queer and not quite straightforward about Mattie. Miss Gaskett, who looked like a returned missionary that had had a hard time of carrying the light into the dark places, seemed rather elated than depressed at the aspersions cast upon her character, and by the time they reached the paint pots she was flaunting Mr. Stott shamelessly, calling him Harry before everybody, and in the evening sitting with him by the campfire on the same saddle blanket. At Mammoth Hot Springs Mrs. Budlong showed her disapproval by refusing to speak to Miss Gaskett, and Miss Gaskett replied by putting on a peekaboo blouse that was a scandal. But Mrs. Budlong herself was not in too high favour, since to the sin of gluttony she had added that of lying and been caught at it. It was a small matter, but, as Mrs. Apple declared indignantly, "It is trifles that betray character," and Mrs. Budlong was treated with marked coldness by the ladies to whom she had prevaricated. It was known beyond the question of a doubt that Mrs. Budlong had purchased food and kept it in her teepee. Therefore, when asked for something to ward off a faint feeling before dinner, and she had denied having anything, they were outspoken in their resentment. "There she stood and lied to our faces," Mrs. Apple declared to her husband afterward, "while her mouth was shining. I could smell sardines on her, and a big cracker crumb was lying on her bosom. Indeed, it's a true saying they have in this country that to know people you must camp with them. I never would have thought that of Hannah Budlong." It was because of this incident and the strained relations which resulted from her perfidy that none of her erstwhile friends responded to her invitation to join her in a bath in a beaver dam of which Mr. Hicks told her when they camped early the next afternoon. Mrs. Budlong's phlegmatic body contained an adventurous spirit, and the delights of a bath in a beaver dam in the heart of a primeval forest appealed to her strongly. To Mr. Hicks, who sought her out purposely to tell her about it, she confided: "Hicks, underneath my worldly exterior I am a child of nature. I love the simple, the primitive. I would live as a wild thing if I could choose my environment." Mr. Hicks nodded sympathetically and understandingly, and returned the confidence: "I am convinced that I was a fawn when the world was young. There are times when I feel the stirrings of my wild nature." Mrs. Budlong regarded him attentively. She never had thought of him as a fawn, but now she noticed that his ears were peculiar. Nobody could have been more obliging and interesting than Mr. Hicks as he guided her to the beaver dam and explained its construction. It had long since been abandoned by the industrious animals that had built it, but their work had been so well done that it was in as good condition as when they had left it. There was nothing to fear from beavers. Anyway, Hicks assured her, he never had known a beaver to attack anybody. In this isolated spot she was as safe from intrusion as if she were in her own bathroom, and after tramping down a spot in the brush for her to stand on, he went away, declaring that he was sure she would have an experience she always would remember. Left alone, Mrs. Budlong felt of the water. It was, as Hicks had said, even warmer than tepid from standing, an ideal temperature. The brush grew high around the pond formed by the backwater and made a perfect shelter. No fear of prying eyes need disturb her. Then a daring thought came to her which made her black eyes sparkle. Suppose she did not wear any bathing suit? What an adventure to relate to her intimate friends when she returned to Mauch Chunk, Pennsylvania! It laid hold of her imaginative mind, and the result was that Mrs. Budlong hung her suit on a bush and went in au naturel. She waded in cautiously, for the bottom was soft and oozy and there were little patches of green floating on the surface that she did not so much like the looks of. Otherwise conditions were perfect, and Mrs. Budlong submerged like a submarine when she reached the middle of it. She came up and stood looking at the sky above her, enjoying the feeling of the sunshine on her skin and the soft, warm breeze that caressed her. She smiled at an interested blue jay, then submerged again, deeper, and the tide rose so that the water lapped bushes and pebbles that had not been wet all summer. Her smile grew wider as she thought what the others were missing, and was considering how much she dared embellish the adventure without being detected. when, suddenly, a look of horror came to her face and stayed there, while screams that sounded more like the screeches of a lynx or mountain lion than those of a human being scared the bluejay and brought those in camp up standing. Piercing, hair raising, unnatural as they were, Mr. Budlong recognized them. "My wife! Help! Murder! Hicks, where is she? Find a weapon and come with us." "I gotta get supper," Hicks replied heartlessly. Mr. Apple, Mr. Stott, and old Mr. Penrose dashed into their tents and dashed out carrying firearms that had been sealed by the park officials, as is customary, while Mr. Budlong, in his frenzy, snatched a pair of scissors from Miss Eyester and headed the posse which expected to pursue the murderer. He was not a murderer yet, however, for Mrs. Budlong's screams had not diminished in volume, although it was feared that worse than death might already have befallen her. Her shrieks guided them like a lighthouse siren, so they lost no time in taking wrong directions, but, at that, it was a considerable distance, and Mr. Budlong, in spite of the agonized thoughts which goaded him forward, was so handicapped by his asthma that he gradually fell to the rear of the rescue party. Mr. Stott was then in the lead, with Mr. Apple a close second, until the latter, who was wearing bedroom slippers, stumped his toes against a rock with such force that he believed them broken. He dropped down immediately with the pain of it, and sat weaving to and fro, clasping his foot to his breast while the others passed him. Mr. Stott called that help was arriving as he crashed through the brush in the vicinity of the beaver dam. To his astonishment, Mrs. Budlong shrieked, "Don't come!" and went on screaming. When he reached the pond, he stopped short and stood there, and old Mr. Penrose joined him an instant later. Mr. Apple, alternately limping and hopping, yet covering ground with surprising rapidity, reached the others ahead of Mr. Budlong, who, staggering with exhaustion, huge drops on his pallid face, and wheezing like an old accordion, all but fainted when he saw the wife of his bosom. Mrs. Budlong, looking like a corn-fed Aphrodite, stood in the middle of the pool, with her fat white back wet and glistening, flecked with brown particles that resembled decayed vegetation. "What's the matter, honey dumpling?" cried Mr. Budlong, shocked and bewildered. For answer, Mrs. Budlong screamed the harder. "I know!" piped up Mr. Apple. "She's covered with leeches, bloodsuckers, and can't get 'em off. I got 'em once swimming in stagnant water." When he spoke, he called attention to the fact of his presence and that of Mr. Stott and old Mr. Penrose. Instead of being grateful for the information and for the assistance the others had expected to render, Mr. Budlong turned on them all furiously. "Get out of here, you peeping toms and spying libertines! Haven't you any shame about you?" He raised the scissors so threateningly that as soon as they recovered from their astonishment, they retreated. But, at that, their haste was not sufficient to appease an outraged husband. Mr. Budlong picked up a pebble and threw it with such a sure aim that it bounced between Mr. Stott's shoulder blades. When he had picked off the bloodsuckers that were battening on Mrs. Budlong, the two returned to camp and lost no time in serving notice on Wallie that they were leaving by the first passing conveyance if they had to buy it. Whether or not Mr. Hicks had known of the leeches was a matter for much discussion, and opinion was about equally divided as to his innocence. He disclaimed all knowledge of them, however, and went about with the air of one cruelly maligned. His martyr-like pose was not convincing to Wallie, who could not rid himself of the suspicion that the incident had been planned, though Pinkey contended that he did not believe Hicks was deep enough to think of anything like that. "Anyhow, he's cost us 3 dudes," said Wallie, which remark was sufficient to set Pinkey figuring with a stick. 3 head of dudes at $5 a day for, say, 11 days is, say, they're gone, and that's all there is to it. The thing for us to do is to see that no more leave." Wallie interrupted practically. "I'm not worryin' about them," Pinkey replied, confidently, "if we can jest hold that cook. We've got to humour him till we get through this trip. Then after he's paid off I aim to work him over and leave him for somebody to drag out." But as if to make amends for the loss he had caused his employers, Hicks' manner grew increasingly saccharine, and he redoubled his efforts to provide entertainment for the guests. By the time they arrived at the Cañon Hotel, Wallie was questioning his suspicions of Hicks and felt inclined to believe that he had been hasty in his judgment. He was undoubtedly an asset, for the entire party hung on his words and relied upon him to see that they missed nothing of interest. Mr. Stott was indebted to him for an experience which relegated the Florida hoot owl to the background, though the thrill of the adventure was so intermingled with anguish that it was impossible to tell where one left off and the other began. Sliding down the snow covered side of a mountain in a frying pan was fraught with all the sensations Hicks had described and some he had omitted. When they had reached the particular spot which he had recommended for the sport, in lieu of a frying pan, Hicks gave Mr. Stott a well worn gold pan that he had found somewhere. Starting at the top with the party as spectators, Mr. Stott shot down the side like the proverbial bullet, but midway his whoops of ecstasy changed to cries of acute distress, owing to the fact that the friction wore a hole through the pan to the size of $1, and Mr. Stott, unable to stop his unique toboggan or endure the torture longer, turned over and finished the trip on his stomach. Mr. Stott's eyes often rested upon Hicks afterward with a questioning look in them, but the cook's solicitude had been so genuine that, cynical as his legal training had made him, he was obliged to think that it was purely an accident which might not happen one time in a million. No point in the park had been anticipated more than the camp at the cañon, where Mr. Hicks averred that the bears came in swarms to regale themselves upon the hotel garbage. Their tour thus far had been a disappointment, in that the wild animals, with which they had been informed the park teemed, were nowhere in evidence. A deer had crossed the road ahead of them, and they had gazed at a band of elk through Mr. Penrose's field glasses, but otherwise they had seen nothing that they could not have seen in Pennsylvania. Mr. Hicks' tales of the bears had aroused their interest to such a point that as soon as the camp site was selected, they loaded their cameras and kodaks and set off immediately to get pictures while the light was favorable. It chanced to be one of the days, however, when the bears had no taste for garbage, and although they waited until nearly supper time, not a bear put in its appearance. Mr. Penrose, in particular, was disappointed and vexed about it, and while it was unreasonable to hold Hicks in any way accountable for their absence, he could not refrain from saying disagreeably: "I think you have exaggerated this bear business, Hicks. I have no doubt that a bear or two may come down occasionally. I have the word of others for it. But as for droves of bears, swarms, I think you have overstated." Mr. Hicks cringed under the criticism and admitted with a conciliatory whine in his voice that was rather sickening: "Perhaps I did enlarge a little, Mr. Penrose. Possibly I was over anxious to be interesting. I apologize sincerely if I have misled and disappointed you. I hope, however, that you will yet have the opportunity of seeing at least one before we leave here." "No such luck!" Mr. Penrose growled at him. "I haven't any idea that I'll see even the tracks. It's a good idea to cut in two everything you're told in this country and then divide it." Mr. Penrose was so hard on Hicks that Mr. Apple interposed quickly. "Do they ever come around at night, Cookie?" "So I have been informed," Mr. Hicks replied conservatively. Pinkey was about to say that bears travel more by night than in daytime when Mr. Apple declared that he intended to sleep in the sleeping bag he had brought with him, but which Mrs. Apple had not permitted him to use because she felt nervous alone in her teepee. Mrs. Apple protested against Mr. Apple thus recklessly exposing himself to danger, but Mr. Apple was mulish in the matter. "If by chance one should come into camp, I would have a good look at him. I may never have another such opportunity." "If you want to take your life in your hands, well and good." So, after supper, Mr. Apple unrolled his sleeping bag and spread it on a level spot not far from the supply wagon. Then he kissed Mrs. Apple, who turned her cheek to him, and buttoned himself into the bag. The talk of bears had made Aunt Lizzie Philbrick so nervous that as an extra precaution she pinned the flap of her tent down securely with a row of safety pins, and Mr. Stott not only slept in more of his clothes than usual, but put a pair of brass knuckles under his pillow. These brass knuckles had been presented to Mr. Stott by a grateful client, for whom he had obtained damages from a street railway company for injuries received through being ejected from a saloon 6 months prior to the date upon which he had fallen off the car step. Brass knuckles and a convenient length of lead pipe were favorite weapons with the clientele, which gave to the waiting room of Mr. Stott's law office an odor reminiscent of a wayfarer's lodging house. The night was a dark one, so dark, in fact, that old Mr. Penrose felt some little hesitation when it came bedtime over going off to sleep by himself in the brush where, owing to his unfortunate habit of snoring so loud as to be beyond anything human, they now placed his teepee. There was not a glimmer of moonlight or starlight to guide him as he went stumbling and crashing through the brush to his rag residence. His thoughts were not so much of 4-footed visitors as of footpads and the ease with which they could attack him and get away with his grandfather's watch which he was wearing. Out in the open, Mr. Apple was enjoying the novelty tremendously, though he was a little too warm for comfort in his fleece-lined bag. But after the last candle had been extinguished, he called to his wife cheerily: "Are you all right, dearie?" Mrs. Apple was not to be so easily propitiated and did not answer, so he called again: "This is great, simply great. I wish you were here with me." Only Mr. Apple and his Maker knew that he screwed up his cheek and winked at the fabrication. Sleep came quickly to the tired tourists, and soon there was no sound save the distant tinkle of the bell on one of the horses and the faint rumble of Mr. Penrose's slumbers. It was 11 o'clock or thereabouts, and the clouds had rifted, letting through the starlight, when dark forms began to lumber from the surrounding woods and pad around the camp, sniffing at various objects and breathing heavily. There were bears of all sizes and ages, ranging from yearlings to grandfathers whose birthdays were lost in antiquity. Mr. Apple, who was a light sleeper and the first to discover them, would have sworn on a monument of Bibles that there were at least 50 of them, the size of mastodons. Palpitating in his sleeping bag in the midst of them, he may be excused for exaggeration, although, exactly, there were only 8 of them. The cold sweat broke out on Mr. Apple, and he thought that surely the thumping of his heart must attract their attention. In such mortal terror as he never had experienced or imagined, he quaked while he speculated as to whether the bear that first discovered him would disembowel him with one stroke of his mighty paw and leave him, or would scrunch his head between his paws and sit down and eat on him. But once the bears had located the supply wagon, they went about their business like trained burglars. Standing on their hind legs, they crowded about it, tearing open sacks, scattering food, tossing things hither and thither, jostling each other and grunting when they found something to their liking. Their grunting and quarreling finally awakened Hicks and McGonnigle, who started up in their blankets, yelling. Their whoops aroused everybody except old Mr. Penrose, who was sleeping with his deaf ear uppermost and would not have heard a Big Bertha. Mr. Stott slipped on his brass knuckles and stood with his head out of the tent opening, adding his shouts to those of Hicks and McGonnigle, who, by now, were hurling such missiles as they could lay their hands on. Instead of having hysterics as might have been expected, Aunt Lizzie Philbrick astonished herself and others by standing out in the open with her petticoat over her nightgown, prepared to give battle with the heel of her slipper to the first bear that attacked her. It was not until Mr. Hicks got hold of two wash basins and used them as cymbals that the bears paid any attention. But this sound, added to the pandemonium of screaming women, finally frightened them. Then, scattering in all directions, they started back to the shadows. Suddenly Mr. Apple let out such a cry as seemed that it must not only split his throat but rend the very heavens. Small wonder! A cinnamon bear weighing in the neighborhood of 800 pounds planted its left hind foot in the pit of his stomach as it went galloping away to the timber. In the brush, where Mr. Penrose had been sleeping tranquilly, other things were happening. In the midst of his slumbers, a dream in which he thought he was being dragged to the fire like a calf for branding came to him. The dream grew so real that it awakened him. He received a swift and unpleasant impression that he was moving. Then he was startled to find that he was not only moving, but moving so rapidly that the canvas bottom of his tent was scraping on the rocks and brush over which it traveled. Mr. Penrose was enraged instantly. At best, he had little patience with practical jokers and none at all with one who had the impudence to awaken him. He called out angrily. The tent stopped moving and there was quiet. Mr. Penrose, who had raised himself on his elbow, laid down and was about to begin where he had left off when his domicile resumed its journey. Now, thoroughly aroused, he sprang up and tore at the flap fastenings. "This is going to stop right here!" he cried furiously. "I do not appreciate this odious Western humor. You have chosen the wrong person to play your jokes on." He reached for the pointed fish pole which was lying in its case in the bottom of the tent and stepped through the opening. A burly figure in a big overcoat stood in the deep shadow, confronting him. Mr. Penrose was barefooted and his soles were tender, but he advanced far enough to bring the pole down with a thwack upon the head of the intruder. "Woof! Woof!" The answer raised his hair and galvanized his whiskers. "Woof! Woof!" A great paw fanned the air. He could feel the wind from it plainly as it reached out to cuff him, and the claws on the end of it tore the front of the flannel shirt in which he slept to ribbons. Woof! Woof! And then a roar that reverberated through the timber. Mr. Penrose swore afterward that the hot breath of the brute was in his face, but the statement is open to question since, at the first woof, he had fallen into his tent backward. No one dreamed of the adventure Mr. Penrose was having until he appeared among them with his shirt bosom in shreds and trembling like an aspen. In one hand he carried a sizable chunk of bacon. "This," he cried, brandishing it, "is what I found tied to my teepee." The explanation was obvious. Somebody had baited his tent for bear on purpose, and since there was no way of obtaining evidence against the culprit, Mr. Penrose in his unreasoning rage accused everybody. "Ever since I came, you have all had a pick on me," he glared at them. "You needn't think you're so smart. I haven't seen it." Everyone was so surprised at the accusation that they could only stare, speechless, at him. With his white beard, rags, and barefooted, Mr. Penrose looked like the Count of Monte Cristo, telling the world what he was going to do to it as he added, waving the bacon, "I'm going home tomorrow, to Delaware, back to my peach orchard. And if any one of you ever say you know me, much less speak to me, I shall deny it. I'm done with the whole caboodle of you." Protestations were useless and efforts to dissuade him from his purpose of leaving. The next morning he packed his bag and started down the road without saying good bye to anyone. His departure reduced the party to half its original number, and that was bad enough, but when by lunch time Mr. Appel had developed a soreness which led him to believe he was injured internally and should consult a physician, the situation became infinitely worse to Wallie and Pinkey. As a matter of course, they expected his wife to accompany him, but what they had not known was that Miss Gaskett had been put in Mrs. Appel's charge by her parents, and in the light of her indiscreet conduct with Mr. Stott, it was deemed best that she should return with them. It was a terrible disappointment to Miss Gaskett, who cried bitterly and, in an unguarded moment, told her age approximately, sobbing that it was preposterous that one of her years should not be permitted to finish a trip which she was so enjoying.
End of Part 1, Chapter 24. Part 2 of Chapter 24 of The Dude Wrangler by Caroline Lockhart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 24, Part 2. But Mrs. Appel was obdurate, declaring that she did not care to take the responsibility of leaving her without a proper chaperone, since Aunt Lizzie was too unworldly to be a safe guardian and Miss Eyster was herself unmarried. Miss Gaskett was compelled to succumb to the argument, and the three were driven to the nearest hotel after luncheon, leaving Wallie and Pinkey with the sickening knowledge that now it was not possible to break even, to say nothing of a profit. Every day they were out would put them in debt a little deeper, but they both were agreed they would finish the trip, whatever happened. The evening was a gloomy one, as compared to others, and although they built a campfire as usual, there was none of the customary gaiety around it. Mr. Stott sat alone on his saddle blanket, lost in meditation of a somber nature, and Pinkey and Miss Eyster whispered apart. Wallie was in no mood for conversation, while Mr. Hicks, with the delicacy which now marked his every action, smoked alone in the shadow, making no effort to intrude himself upon his betters. Even Red McGonnigle, reclining on his elbow, staring into the embers, seemed pensive and disinclined to take advantage of the opportunity which the silence gave him to hear his own voice. So only Aunt Lizzie Philbrick remained to give life to the party, and Aunt Lizzie, while a woman of high principle and fine character, was admittedly not stimulating. Aunt Lizzie had snow white hair drawn tightly from her forehead, and a corpse-like pallor to match it. She could not possibly look any different in her coffin, because so far as appearances went, she might have been dead for a decade. Her manner was helpless, her voice gentle and hesitating, while in repose she ordinarily gave the impression of being in a state of suspended animation. But tonight she was strangely restless. Her thin white hands fluttered nervously, and she moved her camp chair so often that everyone wondered silently what was the matter with her. There was a red spot on either cheek, which might have been the heat of the fire or excitement. At any rate, it was plain to the least observant that Aunt Lizzie was perturbed by something. Finally, during one of her frequent movings, she inadvertently set the leg of her camp chair in a hole and went over backward. Mr. Hicks, who bounded from the shadow, was the first to reach her, and everyone was astonished to hear her cry, when he would have assisted her, "Don't touch me!" Everyone felt rather sorry for Hicks when he returned to his seat, crestfallen, while Aunt Lizzie went off at a stiff-legged trot to her teepee without saying good night to anybody. When some extraordinary accident was not befalling Aunt Lizzie, who seemed the essence of mediocrity, she was always doing the unexpected. So little was thought of it after the first surprise at her rudeness, and the others shortly said good night and retired also. Wallie stood alone by the dying campfire, wondering what the morrow might hold for him, if any bad luck could come that had not already happened. If so, he could not imagine it, for it seemed he had run the gamut of misfortune. In this he was mistaken, for when they stopped at noonday, he received a blow from the last quarter he had expected, Aunt Lizzie. The day had not begun too auspiciously, for when something like 2 miles on their journey, Mr. Stott remembered that he had left his soap on a rock, and since it was expensive soap, felt he must return for it. He had galloped the distance and back again, joining the party with his horse sweating, and Wallie had warned him curtly that the day promised to be a hot one and he must ride slowly. "Please do not get ahead of the grub wagon," Wallie had said with emphasis. Mr. Stott had done as requested just so long as it suited him, and then, passing Wallie with a little laugh of defiance, had raced to lead the procession. In consequence, when Hicks pulled to the roadside for lunch somewhat earlier than usual, Mr. Stott did not know it and continued riding. The heat was terrific, and animals and humans suffered alike, while the gypsum dust, which rose in clouds, added to the discomfort. Gnats and mosquitoes, deer flies and no-see-ums, attacked in clouds, and as viciously as if they had double rows of teeth and rapiers. It was the most unpleasant day they had encountered. Everyone's nerves were on edge, and there has been more gaiety in a mourner's carriage than in the surrey where Red tried vainly to interest Aunt Lizzie. Wallie was too angry with Mr. Stott to care for luncheon, so after a bite he betook himself to the shade of a tree and sat down to smoke with his back against it. He was thinking of the buckskin and how jaded it had looked that morning, and wondering if its already stiffened shoulders would get over it if he pulled off its shoes and turned it into a soft pasture. His speculations were interrupted by Aunt Lizzie, who stood before him twisting her fingers in embarrassment. A peerless beauty could not have passed unscathed through such a morning, but the havoc it had wrought in Aunt Lizzie's looks was nothing short of startling. Her lids were inflamed and swollen from the bites of the no-see-ums, her nose was red, and her eyes watered from the gypsum dust, which affected her like hay fever. Her sailor hat had slipped to the back of her head, and her scolding locks were hanging like a fringe over a soiled linen collar. One would have said that Aunt Lizzie could have traversed the earth unmolested, not excepting the bandits because of whom she had fled Mexico. Something of the sort passed through Wallie's mind as he waited the explanation of her obvious confusion. "I have something very awkward to say to you, Wallie." The harried expression, which was becoming chronic, leapt into his eyes at the introduction, as he asked himself what now might be portending. "It's rather indelicate to discuss with gentlemen," she continued, braiding her fingers. Wallie was alarmed, but, anxious to set her at her ease, he said encouragingly: "You can talk as freely to me as if I were your father." He had not had time to visualize himself as Aunt Lizzie's father when she went on in a short-breathed fashion: "I fear that I shall have to leave you, Wallie, as soon as possible." Wallie's wonder grew, but he said nothing. I think, I fear, I believe," she stammered, "that Mr. Hicks is of a very ardent temperament." Wallie could not have spoken now had he wanted to. "Since yesterday I have found him looking at me frequently in a peculiar manner. Last night he stared at me with his burning eyes until I could feel his hypnotic influence. I trust you will believe I have not given him any encouragement?" Wallie's jaw, which had fallen, prevented him from reassuring her that he believed her blameless. "So far, the tongue of scandal has never laid hands on me," she declared, mixing her metaphors in her agitation. "But I feel that it is a risk I should not take to travel about the country with a company of men and only an unmarried woman in the party." Wallie managed to mumble: "You are as safe here as if you were in a convent, Aunt Lizzie." It would have seemed from her expression that she preferred not to think so. However: "You understand how I feel, don't you?" she pleaded. "Perfectly, perfectly," Wallie replied, too dazed to make any other answer. He would have been only a little less astounded if the old lady had announced her intention of opening a dance hall upon her return to Prouty. Aunt Lizzie's desertion, and for such a reason, was the last thing he had anticipated. It seemed like the final straw laid upon a back already breaking. He watched her toddle away and sat down again gloomily. At the supply wagon, Mr. Hicks was putting the food away, commenting profanely upon the flies, the heat, the tardiness of Mr. Stott, the injustice of things in general, and, in particular, the sordid necessity which obliged him to occupy this humble position when he was so eminently fitted to fill a higher one. He threw a stick at a camp robber that had flown down and taken a pick at a plate on a stump which contained the lunch he had saved for Mr. Stott, and his expression was so diabolic that it was the first time for many days that he looked natural. Red McGonnigle, with his hat over his face, dozed in the shade of the bed wagon. Aunt Lizzie busied herself with preparations for departure. Miss Eyster perused the testimonials for a patent medicine contained in a pamphlet left by previous campers. Insects droned, heat waves shimmered, the horses stood sleeping in their nose bags. It was a peaceful noonday scene, but Macpherson and Company, now sitting on their heels discussing their prospects, or lack of them, had no eye for it. One thought was uppermost. Their bubble was punctured, they were worse than ruined, for their horses and outfit were mortgaged almost up to their value, and, in addition, they had borrowed at the bank, counting on paying off all their indebtedness when the park trip was finished. "I suppose I can get a job herding sheep. There's money in it. But I'll be an old man before I can afford to get married, to say nothing of the disgrace of it." Pinkey's voice sounded hopeless. The plaint gave Wallie such a pang that he could not answer, but with a twig played a game of tic tac toe in the dust, while he thought bitterly that no one could blame Helene Spenceley for preferring Canby to a person who seemed destined to failure in whatever he attempted. He was another of the four fleshers, he told himself, and the country was full of them, who just fell short of doing something and being somebody. Probably, in time, he would have no ambition beyond working for a grub stake in summer so he could shack up in winter. He would let his hair grow and go sockless, and buy new clothes rather than wash his old ones, and eat from soiled dishes and read mail order catalogs for entertainment, and, doggone it, why couldn't he bring himself to think of marrying some respectable girl like the blacksmith's daughter there in Prouty, who had no chin and a fine complexion and cooked like an angel and never said a cross word to anybody. Since Wallie was too uncommunicative to be interesting, Pinkey got up and left him to his reflections, remarking philosophically as he departed to join Miss Eyster: "Well, I never heard of anybody being hanged for owing money, so I guess there's no use in us going around with the double breasted blues over it. We might as well whistle and say we like it." Wallie looked after his partner almost angrily. Oh yes, it was well enough for him to talk about being cheerful and not worrying, but he guessed he would not be so chipper and so easily resigned to disappointment if he had nothing more to which to look forward than he had. The lugubrious voice of Mr. Hicks, declaiming, reached him: "Come fill the cup, and in the fire of spring Your winter garment of repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way To flutter, and the bird is on the wing." That was the worst of it, Wallie thought despairingly. The bird of time had but a little way to flutter. He was so old, 27. The realization that he was still a failure at this advanced age increased his misery. He was a fool to go on hoping that he meant anything to Helene Spenceley or ever would. But just the same, Wallie stood up and squared his shoulders. If he couldn't have the woman he wanted, there wouldn't be any other. He would sell his place for what he could get for it, pay his debts, and go to Tahiti and be a beachcomber, or to Guatemala and start a revolution, or live a hermit in the Arctic Circle, trapping for a fur company. He would do whatever he could to forget her. Then, suddenly, he wished that he was a little boy again and could sit on Aunt Mary's lap and lay his head on her shoulder the way he used to when he came home from school with a sick headache. It always had comforted him. A heartache was worse than a headache by a whole lot. Somehow, he was so lonely, so inexpressibly lonely. He had not felt like this even that first winter on his homestead. A lump rose in his throat to choke him, and he was about to turn away lest someone see the mist in his eyes that blinded him and that he felt horribly ashamed of, when the sound of hoofs attracted his attention and caused him to grow alert in an instant. He was sure that it was Stott returning, and then he caught a glimpse of him through the trees, galloping. "Oh, here you are!" exclaimed that person irritably as he turned off the road and came through the brush toward Wallie. There was a bright shine in Wallie's eyes as he walked toward him. "Why didn't you tell me you were going to camp in the middle of the morning?" Stott demanded in his rasping voice as he dismounted. Wallie returned evenly: "You know as well as I do that choosing a camp is left to Hicks' judgment. I told you not to get ahead of the supply wagon." "If you think I'm going to poke along behind like a snail, you're mistaken," Stott retorted. Wallie's face went white under its tan, though his voice was quiet enough as he answered: "You'll poke this afternoon, I'm thinking." Stott turned sharply. "What do you mean by that?" "Just what I said. Look at that horse." The buckskin's head was hanging. Its legs were trembling. There was not a dry hair on it, and the sweat was running in rivulets. Its sides were swollen at the stirrup where the spurs had pricked it, and the corners of its mouth were raw and bleeding. Wallie continued, and his voice now was savage: "You're one of the people, and there's plenty like you, that ought to be prevented by law from owning either a horse or a gun. This afternoon you'll ride in the surrey or walk, as suits you." Stott laughed insolently. "Oh, I guess not." Wallie calmly loosened the latigo. Stott took a step toward him with his heavy jaw thrust out and his hand
sought his hip pocket. "Don't you take the saddle off that horse." His tone was menacing. A machine that had been purring in the distance passed, slowed up, and stopped a little way beyond the camp. Wallie heard it, but did not look to see whom it might be bringing. As in answer to Stott's threat, he dropped the cinch and laid his hand upon the horn. "If you think I'm bluffing " For answer, Wallie pulled off the saddle. Stott hesitated for the fraction of a second, then his arm shot out and Wallie dropped heavily from the blow beneath the ear which Stott dealt him. There was a sharp cry behind him, but Wallie did not look around as, still dazed, he got to his feet slowly, with his eyes upon his antagonist. "I warned you!" Stott chortled, and he put his hand behind him to conceal the brass knuckles he was wearing. Helene Spenceley was there, her voice had told him, but he took no account of that in the choking, blinding rage which now controlled him. Before Stott could use his cowardly weapon again, Wallie sprang for him, and with the force and rapidity of a trained fighter landed blow after blow on the heavy jaw which made a fine target. "You horse killer! You braggart and cheapskate! You shyster and ambulance chaser!" And with every epithet, Wallie landed a punch that made the lawyer stagger. It was not nice language, it was not a nice thing to do, possibly, and perhaps the soft answer would have been better, but the time had passed when Wallie set any store by being merely nice, and he had forgotten Helene Spenceley's presence, though in any event it would have made no difference. There was only one thought in his mind as he sat astride Stott's chest when Stott went down finally, and that was to make him say "enough" if he had to hammer him past recognition. This did not require so long as one would have thought, considering that person's boasts as to his courage, but, at that, Stott might well be excused for wishing to end the punishment he was receiving. In the face above him, almost brutal in the fury that stamped it, there was no trace to remind Stott of the youth who had painted cabbage roses and knit sweaters. "Let me up!" he cried finally, struggling under the merciless blows that rained upon him. "Say it!" Wallie's voice was implacable. "'Nuff!" Stott whined it. Wallie stopped immediately, and the attorney got to his feet, sullen and humiliated. He stood for a moment, rubbing his neck and eyeing Wallie. Then, with a return of defiance, flung at him. "You'll pay for this, young fellow!" Wallie's short laugh was mocking. "Why don't you sue me for damages? I'd be flattered to death at the implication that I had any money. It might help my credit." With a shrug, he turned and walked toward Helene Spenceley. Her eyes were shining, and there was a singular smile on her face as he went up to her, but whether she smiled or frowned did not seem to matter much to Wallie. He was not a pretty sight at the moment, and he knew it. A lump had risen on his jaw and one eye was closing. His hair was powdered with gypsum dust, and the sleeve of his shirt was torn out at the shoulder. But he had no apologies to make for anything, and there was that in his manner which said so. Helene laughed as she put out her hand to him. "Was that a part of the regular program or an impromptu feature of the day's entertainment?" "It's been brewing," Wallie replied briefly. "Aren't you surprised to see me?" "Not particularly." "Or glad?" "I'm always that." "This came yesterday while I was in Prouty, and I volunteered to deliver it. I thought it might be important." She handed him a telegram. "That was good of you." His face softened a little, and still more as he read the message. He passed it to Helene. "Will you come home if I tell you I was wrong, and won't you? Aunt Mary." Wallie mused softly.
It must have been hard for her to write that. "Will you go?" Helene asked, quickly. Wallie did not answer. He stood motionless, staring at the road where the heat waves shimmered, his absent gaze following a miniature cyclone that picked up and whirled a little cloud of powdered gypsum, while Helene waited. Her eyes were upon his face with an expression that would have arrested his attention if he had seen it, but he seemed to have forgotten her and her question. When he spoke, finally, it was to himself, rather, as if in denunciation of the momentary temptation which the telegram had been to him. "No," emphatically. "I'm not going back like a prodigal who can't stand the gaff any longer. I won't slink into a soft berth because it's offered and admit that I'm not man enough to stand up and take what comes to me. I'm licked again, proper, and," harshly, "I don't expect anybody to believe in me, but I won't stay licked if I can help it." "I'm said to be a good picker, and I've always believed in you, Wallace Macpherson," Helene said, slowly. He stared his incredulity, then replied with ungracious irony: "You concealed it well." "Flattery is bad for growing boys," she smiled mischievously. "I'm sure you've never spoiled anyone by it. You've treated me like a hound, mostly." Her eyes sparkled as she answered: "I like hounds, if they have mettle." "Even when they run themselves down following a cold trail?" he asked in self derision. Her reply was interrupted by voices raised in altercation in the vicinity of the supply wagon. A clump of bushes concealed the disputants, but they easily recognized the rasping nasal tones of Mr. Stott and the menacing bellow peculiar to the cook in moments of excitement. The wrangle ended abruptly, and while Helene and Wallie stood wondering as to what the silence meant, Pinkey, with a wry smile upon his face, came toward them. "Well, I guess we're out of the dude business," he said, laconically. "What's the matter now?" Wallie demanded so savagely that the two burst out laughing. "Nothin' much, except that Hicks is runnin' Stott with the butcher knife and aims to kill him. I don't know as I blame him. He said his grub was full of ants and looked like scraps for Fido." Wallie was alarmed, but Pinkey reassured him. "Don't worry, he won't catch him, unless he's got wings. The gait Stott was travelin'. He'll be at the hotel in about 20 minutes. It's only 5 miles. What do you make of this, partner?" Pinkey handed him a worn and grimy envelope as he added an explanation: "I found it stuck in the cupboard of the wagon." Wallie took the envelope, wondering grimly as he turned it over if there was anything left that could surprise him. There was. On the back was written: "Ellery Hicks insulted August 3rd, this year of our Lord, 1920. Below, in pencil, was a list of the party, with every name crossed out save Mr. Stott's, and at the bottom, ornamented with many curlicues and beautifully shaded, was the significant sentence, with the date as yet blank: "Ellery Hicks avenged August this year of our Lord, 1920." End of Part 2, Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Dude Wrangler by Caroline Lockhart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 25. And just then Mr. Cone stood at his desk, looking all of 10 years younger for his rest at the sanatorium. Indeed, it was difficult to reconcile this smiling, affable host of the Magnolia House with the glaring maniac of homicidal tendencies who had hung over the counter of the Colonial Hotel, fingering the potato pen wiper and hurling bitter personalities at his patrons. The Florida hostelry had just opened, and the influx of guests promised a successful season. Yet there was a regret and a wistfulness in Mr. Cone's brown eyes as they scanned the register, for in the long list there was no name of any member of the Happy Family. As all the world knows, sentiment has no place in business, yet for sentimental reasons solely, Mr. Cone had to date refused to rent to strangers the rooms occupied for so many winters by the same persons. Ordinarily it was so well understood between them that they would return and occupy their usual quarters that he reserved their rooms as a matter of course, and they notified him only when something occurred to change their plans or detain them. But this winter, owing to the circumstances in which they had parted, his common sense told him that if they intended to return to the Magnolia House, they would have so informed him. Nevertheless, so strong were the ties of friendship that Mr. Cone determined to give them 48 hours longer, and if by then he had no word from them, of course there was nothing to think but that the one time pleasant relations were ended forever. There were strangers aplenty. The newcomers had arrived, and Miss Mary Macpherson, but he wanted to see Henry Apple sitting on his veranda, and Mrs. Budlong, and C.D., and Miss Mattie Gaskett. In fact, he missed one not more than another. What did it matter, after all, he reflected, if Cutie had kittens in the linen closet and that Mrs. Apple used the hotel soap to do her laundry? As Mr. Cone looked off across the blue waters of the Gulf, which he could see through the wide open doorway, he wished with all his heart that he had not flown off the handle. The Happy Family had been friends as well as patrons, and without friends what did life amount to? The hotel was full of new people, but in spite of his professional affability, Mr. Cone was not one to cotton to everybody, and it would be a long time, he told himself sadly, before these old friends could be replaced in his affections. He would have listened gladly to the story of how Mr. Apple got his start in life. He was hungry for the sight of Mrs. C.D. Budlong sitting like a potted oleander. He would have welcomed Mr. Cone's generous ears seemed suddenly to quiver. Almost they went forward like those of a startled burro. A voice, obstinate, cantankerous, a voice that could belong to no one on earth but old Mr. Penrose, was engaged outside in a wrangle with a taxicab driver. Before Mr. Cone could get around the desk and at the door to greet him, Mr. Penrose was striding across the office with the porter behind him, round shouldered under the weight of 2 portmanteaux and a bag of golf clubs. Mr. Penrose was the same, but different in an elusive way that Mr. Cone could not define exactly. There was an air about him which, on the spur of the moment, he might have called brigandish. The way he wore his hat, a slight swagger, a something lawless that surely he never had acquired in his peach orchard in Delaware. When Mr. Penrose extended his hand across the counter, Mr. Cone noticed that he was wearing a leather bracelet. As they greeted each other like reunited brothers, there was nothing in the manner of either to indicate that they had parted on any but the happiest terms, though Mr. Penrose's gaze wavered for an instant when he asked: "Is my room ready?" "Since the day before yesterday," replied Mr. Cone, turning to the key rack. Then, generously: "What kind of summer did you have? I trust a pleasant one?" Mr. Penrose's faded eyes grew luminous. His voice quavered with eager enthusiasm as he ignored the efforts of the bellboy to draw his attention to the fact that he was waiting to open his room for him. "Superb! Magnificent! A wonderful experience! The land of adventure, Cone!" Mr. Penrose
peered at him solemnly from under his bushy eyebrows. "I know what it is to look into the jaws of death, literally." Mr. Penrose could look into Mr. Cone's jaws also, for he was so impressive that the lower one dropped automatically. He added, "I am thankful to be alive to tell the story." "You don't mean it!" "Yes. Alone, unarmed, I defended myself against an attack from one of these savage grizzlies of the Rocky Mountains." Mr. Cone's eyes were as round as a child's awaiting a fairy tale. If Mr. Penrose had needed encouragement, they would have furnished it. He continued, "We were camped near the Canyon Hotel, where the bears swarm like flies over the garbage. A remarkable sight. It was a very dark night, so dark, in fact, that I hesitated to go to my teepee, which was placed apart, that I might not be disturbed by the others. I must have my rest, as you will remember. I had been asleep only a few minutes when I was awakened by the feeling that something was happening. It was. My tent was moving, actually bounding over rocks and hummocks. Believing myself the victim of a practical joke, I sprang out and brought my fish pole down on what I supposed to be the head of a fellow disguised in a big overcoat. There was a roar that was plainly heard for miles, and a monster grizzly struck at me. If it had not been for my presence of mind, that would have been the end of me. Now it was all that saved me. As the bear, on his hind legs, came toward me with his arms outstretched to grapple, I ducked and came up between them, and so close to his body that he was unable to sink his terrible claws into me. He let out another roar, simply appalling. It will ring in my ears forever. Almost deafened me. Again my remarkable presence of mind came to my rescue. I reached up and held his jaws open. It was my purpose to dislocate the lower one, if possible. For 15 minutes, 20 perhaps, we fought desperately. Writhing, struggling, I could feel the brute's hot breath on my face, and his lolling tongue dripped saliva. Finally, his heavy breathing told me he was getting winded, and I knew that if my strength did not fail me, I should be the victor. Fortunately, I was in splendid physical condition. Not once did I lose my presence of mind in this terrible crisis. I was as calm as I am this minute, while the bear was letting out roars of rage and pain that curdled the blood of those who heard them. At last I made a superhuman effort and backed the brute up against a tree. Gripping his nose and jaw, I had doubled up my leg and thrust my knee into his stomach, which was, of course, cruel punishment, when, just then— A slight cough made Mr. Penrose turn quickly. Miss Mattie Gaskett, whose eyes were nearly as large as Mr. Cone's at this version of the encounter, was standing behind him with Cutie in a wicker basket. Mr. Penrose looked disconcerted for a moment, and then that presence of mind of which he boasted came to his assistance, and he said ingratiatingly, "This young lady will vouch for the fact that my clothes were in shreds, ribbons." Yes, you had lost your shirt bosom," Miss Gaskett agreed, doubtfully. Remarking that he would finish the story when Mr. Cone had more leisure, Mr. Penrose skedaddled after the bell boy with unmistakable alacrity. "And how is Kitty?" inquired Mr. Cone, beaming upon Miss Gaskett. "Did you take her with you this summer?" As he lifted the cover and looked in the basket, Cutie's pupils enlarged and she shrank from him. Cutie had a good memory. "Luckily for her, I did not," Miss Gaskett answered. "If I had, I should have lost her." "Lost her?" "Coyotes." "They would have eaten her?" Miss Gaskett nodded. "Undoubtedly. They were thick as anything. They howled hideously every morning before sunrise, and it was not safe to leave one's tent at night without a weapon." "Whew!" Mr. Cone's lips puckered in a whistle. His astonishment inspired Miss Gaskett to continue. "Yes, indeed. And once when I was out walking ever so far from everybody I met one face to face. My first impulse was to run, but I thought if I did so it might attack me, so, trying not to show that I was frightened, I picked up a stick and just then—" Seeing that Mr. Cone's gaze wandered, Miss Gaskett paused to learn the cause of it. She was flushed as she found that Mrs. Budlong, with a smile wreathing her face, was listening to the recital. "I'll tell you the rest when you are not so busy," Miss Mattie said, taking her key from Mr. Cone hastily. Mrs. Budlong declared that her pleasure equalled his own when Mr. Cone expressed his delight at seeing her, and there was no thought on the minds of either as to the hotel rules she had violated or the food she had carried away from the table in the front of her blouse and her reticule. "You are looking in splendid health, Mrs. Budlong," he asserted, quite as if that lady ever had looked otherwise. "Yes, the change benefited me greatly." A stranger might have gathered from the plaintive note in her voice that prior to her trip she had been an invalid. "You, too, found the Western country interesting?" "Oh, very. At heart, Mr. Cone, I am a child of nature, and the primitive always appeals to me strongly." Mrs. Budlong hesitated and seemed debating. Having made her decision, she asked in an undertone: "I can trust you?" "Absolutely," replied Mr. Cone with emphasis, which intimated that the torture chamber could not wring from him any secret she chose to deposit. "I had a very peculiar experience in the Yellowstone. I should never mention it if you were not more like a brother to me than a stranger. It is altogether shocking." Mr. Cone's eyes sparkled. "Purely in a spirit of adventure, I took a bath in a beaver dam. It was in a secluded spot, and so well protected that I went in—I did not wear my bathing suit. The birds twittered. The arched trees made a green canopy above me. The sunshine sparkled on the placid bosom of the water. A gentle breeze, warm, sweet scented, caressed me as I drank in the beauty of the scene. Then I plunged in. The temperature was warmer than tepid, delightful. I felt like a nymph, a water sprite, or something, as I swam out to the middle and found a footing. The bottom was rather oozy, and there were green patches floating on the surface. Otherwise it was ideal. Noticing a brown spot on my arm, I touched it. It was squashy and pulpy. Then it moved. A leech! And it sunk 1,000,000 feet into me as soon as I attempted to remove it. I was black with them, if you will believe me, literally covered. Repulsive, disgusting bloodsuckers, sucking my blood like vacuum cleaners, Mr. Cone. Imagine my horror." Mr. Cone tried to. "Another woman would have screamed or fainted," Mrs. Budlong continued, "but I come of different stock, and ancestry will tell at such moments. I am a daughter of the Revolution, and my father fought all through the Civil War as a sutler. Not a sound passed my lips as I got back to shore somehow, and weak from loss of blood, sank down to consider how to get rid of the leeches. In emergencies I am a resourceful woman. Recalling that I had a match, only one little match, in my sweater pocket, it occurred to me that I might build a smudge and smoke them off. I scraped some leaves together, struck my match, and just then—" But just then Mr. Budlong, who had stopped to look after the trunks, scuffled in the doorway, and in his eagerness to greet him, Mr. Cone forgot completely the narrative Mrs. Budlong was reciting for his benefit, nor did he ever hear its termination. Even as the proprietor stood at his desk, wondering if the later train had brought any more prodigals, A commotion on the veranda was followed by the appearance of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Apple. Mr. Apple was using a stick and walking with such difficulty that Mr. Cone hurried forward and asked with real solicitude: "My dear friend, whatever is the matter? Has your old enemy, rheumatism, again got his clutches on you?" "Rheumatism!" Mr. Apple snorted. "You lie on your back with 2,000 pounds on top of you and see how you like it." Mr. Cone was puzzled and said so. Mr. Apple explained tersely: "A bear walked on me, that's all that happened. A silvertip stood on the pit of my stomach and ground his heel into me." Mr. Cone's eyes were popping. "If it were not for the fact that I'm quick in the head, my wife would be a widow. I was in my sleeping bag and saw the bear coming. I knew what was going to happen, and that I had one chance in 1,000. It flashed through my mind that a horned toad, when threatened with danger, will inflate itself to such an extent that a wagon may pass over it, leaving the toad uninjured. I drew a deep breath, expanded my diaphragm to its greatest capacity, and lay rigid. It was all that saved me." Again Mr. Cone's tongue against his teeth clicked his astonishment at this extraordinary experience, and while he congratulated Mr. Apple upon his miraculous escape, he noted that he was wearing souvenirs of his trip in the way of an elk tooth scarf pin and a hatband of braided horsehair. The same train had brought Mrs. J. Harry Stott, apparently, for the elevator was barely closed upon the victim of the picturesque accident to which Mr. Cone had just listened, when the office was illumined by her gracious presence. The last time that lady had extended a supine hand, it had been to offer him one of the most serious affronts that can befall a self-respecting landlord. Now the hand contained only cordiality, and in that spirit Mr. Cone took it. "You enjoyed your summer?" as Mr. Cone passed the pen for her to register. "Delightful! Altogether unique! Do you know, Mr. Cone, I never before have fully appreciated my husband, his splendid courage." "Is that so?" Mr. Cone replied with polite interest. "Yes, when put to the test he was magnificent. You see, we had a cook, oh, a most offensive, a rully, violent and dangerous person. In fact, it was because of him that I left the party prematurely. It was plain that both Wallie and Pinkey were afraid of him and dared not discharge him. So one day, when he had been more objectionable than usual, my husband took things into his own hands. He simply had to. Hicks, his name was Hicks, was disrespectful when Mr. Stott reprimanded him for something, and then he attempted to strike my husband with a pair of brass knuckles. Brass knuckles, it seems, are not a gentleman's weapon, and the cowardly attack so infuriated Mr. Stott that he knocked the bully down and took them away from him. He still has them. Before he let him up he pummeled him. Well, I assure you, Mr. Stott doesn't know how strong he is when angry. Such muscles! He punished the cook until he begged for mercy and promised to do better. But as soon as he was on his feet he tried to stab my husband with a bread knife. Fancy! Mr. Stott took this away from him also, and ran down the road with it. He ran for 7 miles. 7 miles, mind you! The cook was nearly dead when Mr. Stott let up on him. I had to drag this story from my husband little by little, but wasn't it exciting?" Mr. Cone, who never had thought of Mr. Stott as such a warrior, tried to visualize the episode, and though he failed to do so, he was greatly impressed by it. He stood for some time after Mrs. Stott had left him, reflecting enviously that his life was dull and uneventful, and that he must seem a poor stick to the heroes and heroines of such adventures. He wished that he could think of some incident in his past to match these tales of valor, but as he looked back The only thing that occurred to him was the occasion upon which the laundress had stolen the cooking sherry and gone to sleep in her chemise on the front veranda. She had fought like a tiger when the patrol wagon came for her, and he had been the one to hold her feet as she was carried to it. At the time he had been congratulated upon the able and fearless manner in which he had met the emergency, but a bout with an intoxicated laundress, though it had its dangers, seemed a piffling affair as compared to a hand-to-hand combat with a grizzly. Gazing absently through the doorway and comforting himself by thinking that perhaps he, too, had latent courage which would rise to heights of heroism in propitious circumstances, he did not see Miss Eyster, who had come in the side entrance, until she stood before him. He had not expected Miss Eyster, because she was usually employed during the summer, and it was only when a well-to-do relative sent her a check that she could afford a few weeks in Florida. But Miss Eyster was one of his favorites, and he immediately expressed the hope that she was to stay the entire season, while he noticed that she was wearing a mounted bear claw for a hat pin. "No," she said, blushing. Not until then had Mr. Cone observed the Montana diamond flashing on her finger. "Ah?" He raised his eyebrows inquiringly. Miss Eyster nodded. "In January." "A Western millionaire, I venture?" he suggested playfully. "A stockman, indeed." A new respect was in Mr. Cone's manner. "Cattle?" "Sheep," replied Miss Eyster proudly. "Mr. Fripp is herding at present." In a week Mr. Cone was as familiar with the glorious summer which the happy family had spent in the West as if he had been there. Although he knew the story by heart, he still thrilled when Mr. Penrose backed the bear up against a tree and separated its jaws until it moaned like a human. He continued to listen with flattering attention to the recital of the intrepid spinster, who would have given battle to a hungry coyote if it had attacked her, as he did to the account of Mr. Stott's reckless courage in putting to flight a notorious outlaw who had hired out as a cook for some sinister purpose. But gradually Mr. Cone began to detect discrepancies, and he noticed also that the descriptions not only varied but grew more hair-raising with repetition. Also he guessed shrewdly that the reason the members of the happy family never contradicted one another was that they dared not. The day came, finally, when Mr. Cone found it not only expedient but necessary to arrange a signal with the operator at the switchboard for certain contingencies. A close observer might have noticed that a preliminary "That reminds me" was invariably followed by an imperative announcement from the operator that Mr. Cone was wanted on the telephone. A haste which resembled flight frequently marked the departure of other guests when a reminiscence seemed threatening, until, forsooth, the time arrived when they had only themselves for audience, and their "That reminds me" became "Do you remember?" The only wonder was, to those less travelled, that the happy family ever had brought themselves to leave that earthly paradise in Wyoming, even for the winter. The only person whom their enthusiasm did not weary was Miss Mary Macpherson, because directly and indirectly it all redounded to the credit of her nephew, whom she now carefully called Wallace, as more befitting the dignity of a successful dude wrangler than the diminutive. Wallie's refusal to accept her offer had brought tears of disappointment to the eyes of the lonely woman, yet secretly she respected his pride and boasted to strangers of his independence. "My nephew, Wallace Macpherson. You may have heard of him? He has large interests in Wyoming. Went West without a penny, practically. Too proud to accept help from anyone. That's the Macpherson of it. And now, they tell me, he is one of the important men of the country." She was sometimes tempted to mention the extent of his holdings, and put the acreage well up into the thousands. but since Miss Macpherson was a truthful woman with a sensitive conscience, she contented herself with declaring merely: "My nephew, Wallace Macpherson, has a large ranch. Oh, a very large place, several days' ride around it." He was all she had, and blood is far thicker than water. She was hungry for a sight of him, and every day increased her yearning. While letters from him now arrived regularly, he said nothing in any of them of coming to Florida. His extensive interests, she presumed, detained him, and he was too good a business man to neglect affairs that needed him. She had promised to go to him next summer, but next summer was a long way off, and there were times when she was strongly tempted to make the journey in winter in spite of the northern blizzards of which, while fanning themselves, they read with gusto. A blizzard was raging at present, according to the paper from which Mr. Appel was reading the headlines aloud to the group on the veranda. All trains were stalled west of the Mississippi, and there was 3 feet of snow on the level in Denver. "That reminds me." Only too well Mr. Cone knew what Mr. Budlong's remark portended. The hotel proprietor was having an interesting conversation with Mrs. Appel upon the relative merits of moth preventatives, but he arose abruptly. Mr. Budlong squared away again. "That reminds me that I was wondering this morning how deep the snow would be at that point where Mr. Stott slid down the glacier in the gold pan. By the way, Mr. Cone, have you heard that story? It's a good one." Edging toward the doorway, Mr. Cone fairly chattered in his vehemence. "Oh, yes, yes, yes!" Mr. Penrose interrupted eagerly. "The drifts must be about 40 feet high on that stretch south of the Lolabama. There's a gap in the mountain where the wind comes through a whoopin'. I mean the place where the steer chased Aunt Lizzie. Did anyone ever tell you that yarn, Cone?" Mr. Cone, with one foot over the doorsill and clinging to the jamb, as if he half expected they would wrench him loose and make him go back and listen, answered with unmistakable irony: "I think I recall having heard someone mention it." It required more than irony to discourage Mr. Penrose, however, and he insisted petulantly: "Come on back here, Cone. I'll explain just how Wallie jumped that steer and went to the ground with him. It's worth listening to twice." Twice! Mr. Cone had heard it more times than he had fingers and toes. "The telephone's ringing," he pleaded. "Go answer it then. Looks like you'd want to learn something." Miss Macpherson had heard the story an even greater number of times than Mr. Cone, but now she urged Mr. Penrose to repeat it, and he did so with such spirit and so vividly that she shuddered almost continuously through the telling. He concluded by asserting emphatically that if it had not been for his foresight in providing himself with field glasses, the steer would have been running over the flat with Aunt Lizzie impaled on its horns like a naturalist's butterfly before anyone could have prevented it. Mr. Appel opined, when Mr. Penrose had finished, that Canby made a poor showing. "I could have done as well myself if I had been able to get there," he added speculatively. "I suppose Canby and Miss Spenceley are engaged by now, or married. Wallie hasn't mentioned it in his letters, has he?" Miss Macpherson replied in the negative. "He might not, anyway," remarked Mrs. Appel. "Helene was a nice girl and attractive, but I could see that she did not interest him." Mrs. Budlong, who had one eye closed, trying to thread a needle without her glasses, observed succinctly: "Men are funny." She intended to qualify her statement by saying that some are funnier than others, only, before she had time to do so, an exclamation from Miss Macpherson attracted her attention. Following Miss Macpherson's unbelieving stare, she saw Helene and Wallie getting out of the motor bus with a certain air which her experienced eye recognized as married. Mrs. Budlong specialized in detecting newly wedded people, and she was seldom mistaken. Her cleverness along this line sometimes amounted to clairvoyancy, but in this instance no one needed to be supernaturally gifted to recognize the earmarks, for no man could look so radiantly happy as Wallie unless he had inherited $1,000,000 or married the girl he wanted. Miss Mary Macpherson threw her arms about her nephew's neck and kissed him with an impetuosity seemingly incompatible with a lady who wore a high starched collar in summer, and the others welcomed him with a sincerity and warmth which made his eyes grow misty. It was hard to believe, as he looked at them beaming upon him in genuine fondness, that only a few short months before they had been barely speaking to him, or that he had wished the happy family had, as the saying is, a single neck that he might wring it. Above the volley of questions and chatter he heard old Mr. Penrose's querulous voice reproaching him. "I hope you have the grace to be ashamed of yourself for not telling us, Wallace." "If I look sheepish," Wallie replied, smiling, "it may be due to the nature of my new occupation. You see," in reply to their looks of inquiry, "Canby bought me out to get rid of me, and for a far more munificent sum than I ever expected. I reinvested, and am now," with mock dignity, "a wool grower with one Mr. Fripp engaged as foreman." Wallie's eyes twinkled as he added: "I trust that the percentage of loss will not be so great as in the dude business." End of chapter 25. End of The Dude Wrangler by Caroline Lockhart.